Welcome everyone to this webinar on the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD. This is an introduction session for businesses, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome all of you and our speakers. My name is Zabey, and I'm the Executive Director of Business for Nature. So just in terms of this session, we've tried to make it as engaging as possible, giving you just the right amount of information, but not overwhelming you with too much information. But please really do use the chat function to ask any questions, make any comments. This is your time. You have the CBD experts with you right now. So please don't hold back. We're going to try and give you an overview, but anything that you want to know, please do not hesitate to ask. In terms of the agenda, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of Business for Nature and what we've been doing around policy ambition, around nature. And then I'm going to hand over to Markus Lehmann from the CBD Secretariat, who's going to give us the basics around what the CBD is and then how business and finance can engage. We'll then hear from Ying, who I must say is calling in from China. It is midnight in China right now. So we are so incredibly grateful. This morning it was Markus's turn, morning time in Europe, I mean. For our earlier call, Markus is based in Montreal, called in at 5 a.m. So we've got a bit of a competition here if you prefer 5 a.m. or midnight. But in any event, we're delighted that both are with us. And of course, China is the host of the COP15, the big conference that's going to take place. So we'll hear all about that. My colleague Maelle Pelisson is our Advocacy Director, and she'll give us the recap of, well, how can businesses really influence the negotiations and what can you do as companies to engage with us? Business for Nature is a global coalition, mainly of business organizations, as you can see on the screen here, but also leading conservation organizations that have a track record of working with business. Now, together, we aim to unify that leading business voice and demonstrate that there really is credible business leadership and momentum on nature. We're calling for governments to adopt policies now to reverse nature loss in this decade. And we use this positive feedback loop analogy. You may have seen this in other discussions, like in climate, because it makes a lot of sense. What it says is, if you look on the right-hand side, we know that hundreds of companies are already making commitments. They're already taking action to reverse nature loss in different ways. It might be around biodiversity, water, forests, land, waste, etc. But the message there is, even though hundreds are doing this, hundreds of companies, the message is it's not enough. In order to scale and speed up, we need to urgently increase that policy ambition, which in turn will drive even more business action on the ground. So before we go into the policy area specifically, we have a quick poll for those of you, for all of you in fact, which is, how familiar are you with CBD? Now, hopefully you can see the poll. I see people answering. And just to be clear, in case there was any doubt, I mean CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, not the other one that you might be thinking about. I'm not interested if you're familiar with that or not at this point. So here we go. So most of you have already responded. I'll give just one more second. Here we go. Here are the results. I'm going to share the results so that our panelists also know that 63% of our participants are already somewhat familiar with the CBD. So that's excellent. We can go further. You have questions to ask. 18% are not familiar and 19% are very familiar. So those who are very familiar, please also don't hesitate to chip in with your experience as you've been engaging and as you know about the CBD up until now. Great. So now I have about 4 slides very quickly to tell you about Business for Nature's efforts in particular on the convention. So in terms of a key reference, we developed this business guide to the CBD in partnership with our partner, the ICC, one of our key partners. And this is a resource that one of my colleagues will put in the chat for you all to use with a lot of the information we'll cover today. And the CBD is a key focus for us. Why? Because we need an ambitious global agreement on nature. The CBD post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is the equivalent for nature to the 2015 Paris Agreement on Climate. And just as before the Paris Agreement on Climate, many leading business voices came together in a coalition, in fact, called We Mean Business, that again is part of Business for Nature as well. And We Mean Business helped, and that leading business voice gave the courage and comfort to policymakers to make an ambitious climate agreement. So we've got the same opportunity now on nature and biodiversity. It's expected this framework to be adopted at the next conference, COP15, to take place in China, as I mentioned, as the host. And this framework is really important because it sets out the international ambition for nature to 2050. It also identifies a mission for 2030, the kind of global goal for nature, along with a set of targets, including on subsidies and incentives. It will adopt this framework, an approach to increase financial resources for nature and promoting mainstreaming in all decision-making. What's also important, like with the Paris Agreement, is the implementation mechanism to actually make sure that the framework is effectively implemented. And so all of this means that business engagement is essential for a successful CBD COP15 and for a transformational framework, which is the post-2020 framework. Business for Nature has really been focused on trying to get this business momentum and this business drumbeat on nature. So this means that, for example, I'm not going to go into the detail, but we have been contributing directly through the CBD processes. We've given written statements and also verbal statements at the open-ended working group sessions. We've made sure that we have hundreds. Now we have more than 700 companies signed up to the Nature is Everyone's Business call to action, which is urging governments to adopt policies now to reverse nature loss. We've also been feeding into the UNFCCC COP26 process as well. So you can see we've really been active in trying to identify, well, galvanize this energy and this momentum around nature in the business community. And just this week, we have released the latest specific suggestions from Business for Nature to the CBD to strengthen this framework. And there are 9 main suggestions that were built on with input from all of our partners, but also more than 100 companies did provide input into developing these 9 key suggestions. So with that, these are all references and material that are available for you. And with that, I will now hand over to Markus. It's my great pleasure. Markus and I have known each other for many, many years. And I think we share the same excitement of, you know, finally it feels like nature has its, and biodiversity has its place on the global agenda, and we've got to really make it count. So Markus, over to you to tell us all about CBD. Thank you.
Thanks, Eva, also for inviting me to that event. Good day, everyone. Yeah, I will be pleased to basically explain a bit what the CBD is, how we engage with businesses as an primarily intergovernmental process, and then how specifically we see business engagement being rolled out during the development of the post-2020 framework and beyond. So if I could, yeah, thanks. Perhaps just as a quick reminder, why biodiversity matters and matters in particular for businesses. I found a pretty central sentence in the rationale of the current strategic plan for biodiversity, which basically provides an explanation linking biodiversity to human well-being. And the bridging concept here is really the concept of ecosystem services. Biodiversity, it says, underpins the functioning of ecosystems and the provisioning of ecosystem services that in turn are essential for human well-being. And we can think about food security, human health, clean air and water, etc. Now, there have been in the past decade, but also very recently, a couple of path-breaking reports trying to quantify the values of these ecosystem services, but then also providing more information about the underlying, let's say, scientific rationale pointing to biodiversity decline. So I'm not going through that in detail. In a couple of days, I think we are going to see another important report, the Scripter review, which will equally talking about that, sponsored by the UK government. So next slide, please. Yeah, I'm basically responding to that, and the insight was already with us in the 1990s. The convention was basically created, was one of the outcomes of the Rio Convention in 1992, the United Nations Convention on Sustainable Development in Rio de Janeiro. 1993, the convention entered into force, and it currently has 196 contracting parties, that is 905 states, and the European Union as a regional organization. And then, of course, we also, that's why we talk about the CBD being one of the 3 Rio conventions, together with the Convention on Desertification and the Climate Convention. So the convention has 3 main objectives: that the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of its components. And then the 3rd objective talks specifically about the utilization of genetic resources and the need to ensure a fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from this utilization. So just to be, perhaps just to be clear, the convention and the underlying protocols are legally binding. It is international law. But of course, given that it is a global convention, the obligations spelled out are of a more generic nature. So there is a need to basically have further interpretative text, so to say, that gives guidance on how to implement these provisions. And that's where the COP decisions, the decisions of the Conference of the Parties, come in. And that's where also our current strategic plans can come in, but also the work for the future policy framework. We're not calling it strategic plan yet for the coming decade. So coming back to the protocols, we have 2. The Nagoya Protocol, specifically focused on the 3rd objective of the convention I just mentioned. And of course, that's of direct interest for a number of companies, for a number of economic and business sectors. And then the Cartagena Protocol on living modified organisms resulting from biotechnology. And again, the linkage to some business sectors is obvious. Next slide, please. Yeah. This is a quick snapshot of the main, let's say, the main elements of the CBD's governance structure. We mentioned already the Conference of the Parties, which is the supreme decision-making body of the convention. It convenes every other year. Of course, now with the ongoing pandemic, we are slightly delayed, or we are, in fact, more than slightly delayed. But the important thing to realize is that the meeting of the COP is actually the culmination of the work, in a say, the culmination and the endpoint of a work in a given biennium. But there is always significant preparatory work undertaken by the subsidiary bodies. So we basically have two major ones: the subsidiary body on technical and scientific issues, and the subsidiary body on policy implementation. For this biennium in particular, we have also an open-ended working group dedicated to develop the post-2020 global biodiversity framework as a successor to the current strategic plan for biodiversity. So perhaps I digress here a bit because I'm fully expecting a question that was also raised in
I was just about to say, exactly.
Exactly. So as I mentioned, these meetings are imperative to, I mean, the meetings of the subsidiary bodies are imperative as a preparatory step towards the meeting of the Conference of the Parties. Now, that has then a direct impact, of course, on the calendar, because these bodies have to meet. You have to have a certain timeline for the release of the preparatory documents, etc., etc. Now, you might be aware that the COP is still formally announced for the second quarter of 2021 in May. But of course, with these subsidiary bodies not yet having met, this is becoming increasingly tight. And of course, we know how difficult it is with the ongoing pandemic to make clear plans. So I can't divulge anything concrete right now, except to say that there is discussions ongoing between the host government and the Secretariat, and also, of course, involving the bureau of the convention, which is a kind of let's say party-led committee overseeing the intersessional process. And as I said, I mean, these discussions on whether to have a new date and when that new date will be, and then also what specific modalities are being contemplated and rolled out for the COP and the subsidiary body meetings, that is under discussion. I'm given to understand that the discussion is pretty advanced, if not close to final. So I can just say, please stay tuned. Look at the CBD website, look at the news feed from the CBD. You should learn more about that very soon. Shall we move to the, yeah, thank you. So I mentioned the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is being developed in draft form by the open-ended working group under the leadership of two co-chairs, one from the north, one from the south. We now have a revised zero draft, which will be considered by the third meeting of the open-ended working group. The revised zero draft contains a Vision 2050, which is basically taking over from the current strategic plan and talks to the overall, let's say, umbrella headline. Perhaps you might hear about that before: living in harmony with nature. Then specifically for the time period of the post-2020 framework, we have a Mission 2030 to put biodiversity on a path to recovery. And underneath, we have 4 long-term goals, which go until 2050, but then under those, 20 action-oriented targets. And as a separate document, but closely related, a monitoring and review framework, basically setting out proposed indicators to monitor progress against the targets and the goals. So we talk about the role of the business and finance sectors post-2020. They are, of course, as one of the major stakeholders, invited to contribute to the development of the post-2020 framework by providing inputs, thought pieces, exactly in line what Eva just mentioned, what had been prepared by Business for Nature. From the business perspective, can be and will be very useful to be, I come back to that, textual suggestions to the specific textual suggestions to the post-2020 framework as well. But then, of course, thinking beyond the development of the policy framework and to start think about the implementation. So what can businesses do proactively to basically scale their ambition in terms of biodiversity conservation and sustainable use? And if they want to commit to that, make these commitments public. We provide a specific platform for that, which is called Action Agenda, which includes a specific window, if you may, for business commitments. And in order to basically support that process, also engage in the relevant fora and the relevant networks to share information about successful case examples from their own practice, so that we can basically identify best practices for everyone, or for the ones that want to use it for emulation and for scaling. Next slide, please. So specifically with regard to implementation, what can it mean in a bit more concrete terms at the business level? Of course, one important first step is to identify, analyze, recognize, and specify the materiality of biodiversity for an individual businesses, both in terms of dependencies and impacts. And that, here we made a very, from past analysis, we made a very interesting observation. We found that many companies actually assign low materiality to biodiversity, even though they might actually work in sectors that are very close to nature, such as, for instance, forestry. So they would then identify, say, high materiality for forest ecosystems, but low materiality for biodiversity, which is interesting because it points to some lack of understanding of what biodiversity implies. And I refer to my earlier quote, the fact that biodiversity underpins ecosystem functioning through resilience, etc., and the provision of ecosystem services like timber, for instance, right? So more needs to be done on that front, that's very clear. But then the second important step is, of course, to integrate the values of biodiversity into decision-making processes across business operations, in the case of finance sector businesses, across portfolios of assets, and then as a next step, greening the greening supply chains and greening these portfolios across the board. There's also a very useful window for action in terms of increasing funding for biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. That again talks specifically to finance sector actors. And last but not least, measuring and reporting on dependencies and impacts. And many of you might be aware that there is now a process ongoing to establish a task force on nature-related financial disclosure, which actually works against that particular goal. So next slide, please. Before I close, I quickly wanted to mention what we are doing in the convention and in the Secretariat on business engagement. In fact, we have a certain legacy going back at least 10 years where we have dedicated COP decisions talking on how to better engage that important stakeholder. What we rolled out back then, and which is now pretty well established, is the Global Partnership on Business and Biodiversity. Now, this global partnership consists, it's a loose umbrella organization, and the core is really the 22 national and regional partnerships on business and biodiversity we have in countries, but we have a couple of regional ones. So the total number of countries is covered is more like in the 60s or low 70s. Now, these national partnership initiatives, they basically try to promote what I'm just talking about on my last slide at the national level, helping to support implementation by businesses, implementation of the CBD at the national level by businesses. And oh, could I? Yeah, thank you. So What we do is to, could you go back to the earlier slide, please, just for 1 minute? Yeah. So we basically organize information sharing, development of good practices, tools, mechanisms, metrics, etc., etc. So from that perspective, this global partnership it has a different approach, a different organizational structure that BFN, which mainly brings together global business associations. And from that perspective, the two complement each other quite usefully. And of course, we do liaise with many global business associations, sectorial associations, and many are now assembled in BFN, which of course, as a bundling force, is very useful to organize the talk. Yeah, I'm not going to more in depth on the activities, but I also wanted to mention that we are rolling out now a work program to scale engagement specifically of finance sector actors, both public and private. They have been around in the CBD as a past, but given their central role, we found it would be important to basically scale their visibility, so to say. So yeah, that is an ongoing process. Could I now have the next slide, please? Yeah. Now specifically, and that's basically serving as a bridge to the next talk on my colleague on COP15 in China. Just wanted to mention a couple of things going beyond the engagement towards the factual negotiations. There will be a technology and innovation expo, so for on technologies that are important for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So for businesses engaged in that area, that is an interesting opportunity. We also have a huge number of side events on all kinds of topics. So if businesses or business associations want to organize that, there isn't basically a structured way of indicating interest. There will be an online registration tool being implemented in due course, a couple of months before the COP. These side events are typically 90 minutes event, either over lunch or over in the evening, and it's basically up to the individual organizer to do with these 90 minutes what they want. The high-level segment, the ministerial segment, is also an important entry point because it is basically bringing together the ministers from the contracting parties that hold the biodiversity portfolio. So it's mostly environment ministries, but there has been strong attempts in the past to broaden the scope and to organize a discussion, also including key stakeholders such as business presence. And in past COPs, we had quite significant business representation at the high-level segment. Of course, then at senior or CEO level. Now, last but not least, and we are going to hear a bit more about that in a second, is the Business and Biodiversity Forum, which is, of course, going way beyond an individual side event because it typically is a two-day event organized by the Secretariat and by the host government. It is typically organized back-to-back with a high-level segment to organize, synergy and exchange of speakers, etc., etc. And it provides basically a global forum to exchange information, good practices, lessons learned, what is going on in countries, what is going on in particular businesses, etc. This time, we are also preparing or planning for one session where basically businesses can announce in an organized and very visible way their commitments for the coming decade. With that, I think I'm coming to the end of my presentation.
Thank you.
And yeah, thanks.
Thanks so much, Markus. That was a really helpful overview. We've understood that for the CBD, business and finance have a key role to play for a number of reasons. And also you heard through that, I'm sure, that COP15 dates are not yet confirmed. We know that a lot of dates are floating around or months are floating around, and the message so far is that nothing is confirmed. So it's also good to have that clarity. So thank you for that, Markus.
Even though I have to admit, in that case, it's rather lack of clarity, but I beg for your understanding given the global situation.
Yes, we all need to navigate through that uncertainty for sure. And then what was great in the chat, and please do feel free to ask questions and make comments. I saw there was people sharing some of the resources, like the important We Value Nature capacity building and information resource for companies wanting to understand how to embed nature in their decision making. But more broadly, I think also from the earlier call, there is this question about how does the CBD and the engagement with companies and then the overall framework link to the existing SDGs, the existing, the work upcoming on the science-based targets for nature. Someone in the chat also, Priscilla, asked about the IUCN guidelines for planning and monitoring corporate biodiversity performance, but also the nature-based solutions. So, there are lots of these different pieces and tools, and maybe we can come to it at the end, but I just wanted to flag it already because I think as companies are engaged in so many different aspects, it's important for us to consciously bring all of those pieces together as well. Do you have any immediate reflections? Yeah.
I could talk about that for hours about,
So let's leave it to the end then. Yeah.
Elements, but I mean, of course, I will hold back.
Okay, great. We'll come back to that. But what I want as a message to be clear for everyone, because it was really helpful to hear also about the Global Partnership for Business and Biodiversity. Business for Nature is here to help. Like, we're trying to just help amplify and get that engagement, even, boost that. And COP15 is a key moment. So thanks, Markus. We're going to now move on to Wang Ying. It's my absolute honor and pleasure to introduce Wang Ying from the Chinese Ministry of Ecology and Environment. Wang Ying, who those who missed it, it's about midnight right now for you. We are absolutely thrilled that you're with us. Thank you. We really appreciate it. And we'd love to hear from you a bit more about COP15 and what Markus just was telling us about the very important Business and Biodiversity Forum as well. Over to you, Wang Ying, and I can move your slides for you.
Okay, thank you, Eva. I thank you for this opportunity and invitation by the Business for Nature. So I would like to give a brief briefing on preparation for the COP15, especially the Business and Biodiversity Forum, and I also what we have done for promote China Business and the Biodiversity Partnership. Next slide, please. Yes. So the COP15, namely a UN Biodiversity Conference, comprised of formal sessions and a high-level segment, also 8 parallel events. All this activity will be under the same ecological civilization, building a shared future for all life on Earth. So the structure for COP15 is just like this picture. This is a formal session. We call it a negotiation process. A high level is here. And our business is here in the parallel events. And beside this, we have around 300 side events and exhibition. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. So I would skip this slide because this format of a forum already mentioned by Markus. So please, next slide. Okay, I would like to take this opportunity to talk more about the CBBP. And as Markus just mentioned, the business engagement program is the major work guided by the current strategy under the CBD process. So in response to the global partnership for business and biodiversity, China joined this process in 2015 in order to promote the China Business and Biodiversity Partnership. And since then, my colleagues at FECO have been striving to help enterprises and the industry to get better understanding about the biodiversity and the CBD process through introducing the economics of ecological ecosystem and biodiversity in business and enterprises, and also natural capital protocol, organizing training, workshop, and developing tools to improve their performance in terms of risk analysis, natural capital accounting, etc. So this picture shows our history of what we have done. This is a protocol. You may notice, you may familiar with all these books. And this is one of the global partnership for business biodiversity. This is annual meeting we joined. Next, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. So what's the CBBP? Actually, this is a long-term mechanism we would like to develop in the future or currently. And it could be one of currently 22 national and regional initiatives, GP, Global Partnership for Business and Biodiversity. And it should be inclusive network based on voluntary, which will bring together multilateral stakeholders, not just enterprises. And in promoting nature-based solution at home and abroad. I will also envisage this partnership as a bridge which join business and the policymakers. And we envisage also this platform should be play as a leverage for mobilizing social resources in supporting post-2020 biodiversity framework and a catalyst for positive change towards green and sustainable development. Next slide. Okay, I sorry forgot very important the structure. No, the previous slide, please, again. Yes, I would like to mention this, all this activity we would like to organize under the framework of this partnership. Okay, next, please. So we want to take the momentum of the summit on biodiversity just taken place in last September to further BBF draft agenda in strong collaboration with our partners, especially the Secretariat CBD, and co-organize serious events in the summer in the run-up COP15 with our partner like WWF, WBCSD, WRI, etc. I just mentioned a few. And we would also like Austria and networking potential partner, especially Business for Nature. Today, this is a very good starting point today. And we would develop a chapter of CBBP together with interesting partners and to combine best practice cases, etc. So that's all for me. And due to the time strains, I don't mention anymore about BBF and the CBBT. If you have questions, and just contact us, and we will answer your question later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ying. It was really helpful to see your perspectives. I am very enthusiastic and energized by the fact that there is so much now going on and that there are so many opportunities to collaborate with so many partners around this. So thank you. Ying has also, there is a draft agenda for the Business and Biodiversity Forum, and in due course, as that evolves, we can share progress with all of you on the line as a follow-up, as more things become available. So thank you so much again, Ying. And also, once again, don't hesitate to add questions or comments in the chat. I'm now going to hand over to Maelle for the final recap of how you can help influence the post-2020 framework. And then we will have some more time for discussion and questions. So Maelle, over to you.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you so much to Markus and Ying for your detailed presentation. I hope that now all our attendees are CBD experts and that you all understand the importance of the agreement that is being negotiated. So as Eva mentioned, Business for Nature's objective is to demonstrate a credible business leadership on nature and to amplify a powerful leading business voice. And that includes calling for governments to adopt ambitious policies, including the COP15 framework. But to achieve that, we really need your help of all of you. So I would like to highlight now 4 actions that you could take right now to engage with us, with Business for Nature, in our advocacy with the CBD. So the first action, and Eva mentioned this call to action, that Business for Nature is leading. Nature is everyone's business. So we're calling on all of you to add your voice to the business momentum by signing this call to action that is calling on governments to adopt policies now to reverse nature loss in this decade. This is essential for us to give us the credibility we need when we engage with policymakers at the CBD and beyond. And for you to sign, it's a very easy process. You can go on our website and fill the form. It's just to be clear, it's not a business commitment. It's just by signing, you're just demonstrating that your company is supporting this level of ambition and this message so that we can take it then to policymakers. The second action that you can take is expressing your interest in supporting Business for Nature advocacy activities. As Eva mentioned, we just published our position on the post-2020 framework. And as the next step, we are starting an active outreach campaign to the CBD policymakers in various governments, where we want to bring this business voice. And to do that, we are currently doing a mapping of companies that are interested in joining our activities. So we are asking all of you, if you want to join this outreach and are supporting our position, to fill the short survey. And you can see the link here, and I think my colleague will put it in the chat. So it's a very short survey that with a few questions that you can fill, and that would help us include you in our mapping and engage with you in our activities and make sure you are up to date with what we are planning. The third action is we need you to raise your voice for nature. We need you to talk about the actions that your company is already taking on nature, and also to call for ambitious policies to accelerate further business action. So to do that, you can, for example, send us a quote of support on our policy recommendation from your CEO or from any senior representative. And we are then using this on our website, social media, or when we engage with policymakers. You can also publish an op-ed from your CEO or, again, any senior representative on nature. And we're very happy to help you with content or with placement. So if this is something you think your company is interested in doing, please let us know, and we're happy to work with you on this. And please feel free to share your support for Business for Nature, for our position, the work, or in general for nature on your website, and to follow us on all the social media. We have presence on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. So feel free to retweet and engage in this discussion. Finally, the last thing is we really need to ensure a strong business presence at the COP15. I think it was mentioned in the chat that the last COP, the Business and Biodiversity Forum, was very interesting, but not well attended by business. And now we're seeing this business momentum growing. So we need to make sure that at COP15, we have a lot of representation from business. I know it's quite hard to plan because the dates are really much unknown, but we are already seeing this momentum by receiving a lot of expression of interest from companies saying that their CEO is really keen to attend the Business and Biodiversity Forum and to speak at high-level events. So feel free to already discuss this with your senior management to make sure that these events are on the radar once we have more clarity on the dates. And if your CEO or anyone from your company is planning to attend, please let us know. We are very happy to help securing speaking opportunities and making sure that business voice is present in many of the side events and the discussion at this meeting. So on the next slide, you can see a short summary of those 4 actions, very easy for hopefully for all of you to do. So before we have a bit of time for Q&A, but before we do that, we would want to do a last survey with you, just to ask which of these activities you think you would be able to do. It's just an anonymous and non-binding survey, so feel free to be honest and just tell us what you think. And yeah, and then feel free to add more questions on the chat. We'll now open the floor and ask a few questions to our panelists. Maybe before, I'm not sure if everyone has filled the survey, we can see the results. And if Markus and Ying can come back on the screen, I think we have a few questions. And I think the first question was for you, Markus. I'm sure you're very keen now to answer this question that Eva asked you earlier on how the CBD and what's the link between the SDGs, SBTN, the IUCN guidelines, and all this initiative, and how can we bring all this together? So maybe over to you for this first question.
Yes, and you stopped me after 30 minutes, okay? No, seriously. I mean, so generally speaking, I mean, this linkage has always been on the radar, right? Even when the post-2015 global development framework was being developed by the UN in New York. And we basically both contracting parties, but then also the Secretariat, we made quite some efforts, including efforts behind the scenes to put biodiversity on the map in the 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. So the way it looks now, in terms of the architecture, of course, our 2 main sweet spots, so to say, are SDGs 14 and 15 on oceans and land, life on land and life underwater. And if you look through there, it's 15 in particular, life on land. There is a mixture of biodiversity, then specifically focusing on forests and other issues like desertification and making the linkages to nature. So that's our core thing. But of course, the important thing is, and in particular, looking from the business engagement perspective, from a mainstreaming perspective, and what I said, dependencies on biodiversity, but also impacts on biodiversity and nature. Many other SDGs are also relevant. Like, for instance, on the one on food includes provisions or targets on directly related to our agenda. The water SDG includes target 6.6, which makes the links to ecosystem services in the water sphere, etc., etc. So there is a number of cross linkages. If you are interested in these kind of more like analytical details in the policy framework, we have publications on our website that cover that. And of course, in the discussions on the post-2020 framework, there is a strong wish expressed by parties, and I'm very reluctant to use that term normally, but in that case, I would say I think there is probably a consensus among parties and among the CBD community that these linkages need to be maintained and if possible even further strengthened, on making them even more explicit. So, and from that perspective, the post-2020 framework is certainly being developed with a clear focus on the 2030 agenda and how it can link to that, both contributing to the 2030 agenda, but also making sure that implementation of certain other elements of the 2030 agenda does not harm biodiversity. So that's in a nutshell.
Thank you. And we got a related question in the chat from Giant, who is asking how you are coordinating with the COP26 on climate.
It is, as you know, I mean, we have talk among international lawyers about squatted environmental governments, right? Don't we? So we do coordinate, yes. We have, for instance, in concrete terms, we have a liaison group of the 3 Rio conventions that bring together the CCD and climate and the CBD. And of course, we look at each other very closely. So we certainly look at what is in the Paris Agreement that is of interest for us. The term nature-based solution has already been mentioned. We're looking at synergies on the implementation side, including, you know, working with the GCF, for instance. I have to say, and I'm very open here, given that it is independent intergovernmental processes, even though it's basically the same contracting parties, it's not always easy or perfect, right? And so that there is certainly room for improvement. But yes, all I can say is we do coordinate.
Well, please let us know, Markus, if there's anything that we can help with also in that messaging, because what's very clear in the business voice is that, you know, we can't tackle climate without nature as our ally, and we know that. We can't, you know, meet the biodiversity agreement without a stable climate, and we can't. So, you know, I think all of that messaging, let us know if there's something else, if you have ideas of how we can help hammer that message home too. Interesting.
Thank you. And we have a few questions also related to the role of business and how we can engage business more. So the first one actually we received this morning that was interesting, I think, is the framework will include, at the moment is including 20 targets for governments, but we know that, as you mentioned, we need business in the implementation if we want those targets to be met. So how can we make those targets easily understandable for business, and how are we, you know, showing their contribution? And maybe another question also related to, and maybe Ying can also help with that, on the Business and Biodiversity Framework Forum. You know, how can we make sure that we have a higher business participation than we had in COP14, and make sure that there's a direct link with the negotiations and that business see the value of attending those meetings? So maybe Markus, if you want to start, and then maybe Ying wants to add on the Business and Biodiversity Forum.
Sure. Can you remind me what the first question was? Because I was becoming focused on the Business and Biodiversity Forum question, but
actually the answer maybe to this, the second question is saying, Eva just showed the result of the poll, and we can see that actually 74% of people around on the line are planning to attend the CBD. So, but the first question was on the targets. How can we make the targets understandable and contribute?
I very much appreciate that question, because it has been, in fact, one of the criticisms of the existing strategic plan, that the targets that were contained in there, the Aichi biodiversity targets, were not always readily understandable or translatable by businesses into their operations and practices. Now, I'm not business, right? I'm a UN bureaucrat. So I can try to think how businesses operate, but the best way to achieve that is to try to make these targets in their development phase as understandable to businesses as can be, right? Obviously, it is a negotiating process. There will be many people pulling and pushing on the text. And of course, it will to some extent be a committee text, and that tends to be a bit unwieldy, right? But on the other hand, if you get your voices heard, I would hope that at least that can be taken into account. What does it imply on the implementation phase? And this is why I think it is so appreciated that your submission actually contains specific textual suggestions onto those targets. That's something that concrete that the parties can eventually use in their negotiations. So that's one component. But of course, if we move towards the implementation phase, I think it will also, let's say, fall on the shoulders of these kind of intermediate organizations, networks, initiatives like BFN and the member organizations, but also the Global Partnership and the Secretariat, do any remaining needed explanation or basically guidance, what it actually means and what tools do you have. I mean, for instance, right, I mean, we have from the Natural Capital Coalition or the Capitals Coalition, we have that protocol, Natural Capital Protocol, around for a number of years now. That remains a very useful tool for the future. So, but there's others, right? And that can then help as a kind of giving that kind of, I almost call it capacity building or capacity enhancement framework for businesses. So that's one element. Perhaps I leave the forum element to Ying, even though I would also have some ideas, but I'm in the interest of time.
You're on mute, Ying.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, we also have the same question to the Secretariat. We think we need a guideline or guidance from the COP, from parties and the government, or from the Secretariat. We do got some inquiry from the enterprise industry, and they are big group. They also get involved in some sustainable development in their operation, and they really want to showcase their contribution towards the achievement towards the biodiversity conservation and climate change, tackling climate change at the same time, based on the nature-based operation solution. But they have a same question: how can they their contribution, how to make their contribution integrated into national commitment or something like that. You know, in the MEAs, only one MEA, that's in the Montreal Protocol, there's a sector approach when they implement this convention, Vienna Convention. But the other, including UNFCCC, the parties, they refuse to take the sector approach in terms of implementation. So for CBD, we don't know in the future how to proceed the business or the business and community engagement in this process. But we know this is at a very starting point to promote the engagement. So at this stage, we don't worry about that because we need to mobilize the business community and other stakeholders in this process. That's why we promote the China Partnership for Business and Biodiversity. My working unit, FECO, is as a catalyze or bridge to interpret the CBD wording into the wording that's the business community they can easily understand. So we think to promote more national and regional partnership in this regard is the one way solution. One solution.
Thank you, Ying.
All.
Thank you so much. We are getting on time, so there's a few questions we didn't have the chance, but we'll make sure we answer this question when we send the slides and the recording of this information session. So I'll hand over to you, Eva, for the final word.
Thank you so much, Maelle. And I think what Ying, you just ended on, how do you interpret and bring that down to the reality of businesses, the actions on the ground. A comment in the chat is not just, you know, the risk of potentially greenwashing exists, you know, and this isn't the idea, because at the end of the day, nature is at a tipping point. This isn't a fake, you know, issue that we're dealing with. This is we need to make sure that we all operate within the limits of the planet. And at the same time, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But this conversation has demonstrated that there is leadership, there is momentum, and there is collaboration. So thank you once again to the panelists. Together, let's protect, restore, and sustainably use our natural resources. Thanks everyone ever so much. We'll be in touch. All the best. Bye for now.
Thank you
Bye.
so much.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much. Bye.